Today, this year's subject is Mark as Read, Managing Email Overload. Today, we'll be hearing from a variety of system-wide experts on archives, records management, privacy, information security, and more to help you understand the importance of managing your email and how to best do it. We've reserved time at the end of the presentations for questions. You can ask questions through Q&A, or you can put your questions in chat. Jackie and Neil will be monitoring those, and we'll try to address them as we go along or at the end. So let's go ahead and get right into our presentations. Our first speakers will be April Sather, Chief Information Security Officer at UCOP, and Sajad Mateen. He's our system-wide cybersecurity counsel, also at UCOP. And they will be talking to you about cybersecurity and legal risks.
April, you're on mute.
I hope everyone see my screen. Quick test. Okay, so thank you so much. I'm looking forward to sharing a bit of the UCOP story today. I currently, as shared service CISO here at UCOP, and prior to that, I was part of the security team at UC Irvine, and joining today as shared as co-presenter is Sajad Mateen.
Hi, I'm Sajad Mateen. I'm with our Office of General Counsel, and I'm the Cybersecurity Counsel. My position is more of a system-wide position. So if you ever have, after ingesting all of these slides and these presentations, you have any questions from a legal perspective, feel free to just reach out to me, and I can find who best within the General Counsel's office to provide answers or guidance.
So we'd like to spend the next few minutes discussing some of the risks related to email retention, both cyber and legal, share some strategies to address, including a window into our own story. But first, I'd like to start with kind of a review of how we got here. Flashback to 1971, MIT graduate and engineer Ray Tomlinson, co-creator of ARPANET, developed the first application for network mail, and the @ addressing scheme still in use today. Fast forward to 2023, and we are experiencing an explosion in email, 347 billion emails sent and received per day, 85% of which unfortunately are spam. 4.26 billion users globally, representing roughly half of the Earth's population. The statistic most relevant today is really that we are spending about 4 hours of our day reading, writing, and managing email. The average employee receives 121 emails a day and sends out 33. But over time, I think we can all agree that email has evolved from just a communication tool to our virtual filing cabinet, enabled by affordable storage and powerful search capabilities. So the results, we have a treasure trove of sensitive content that is very attractive to cyber criminals and profitable. We also have created a daunting volume of data to secure and to later sift through during e-discovery or public records requests. So what can go wrong? So I've just chosen a handful of risks from a cybersecurity perspective to kind of share today. And the first one is phishing. Phishing an individual employee who falls victim to a phishing email, and that could lead to unauthorized access to that individual's email account, gaining insights into communication patterns and contacts. And this can enable very advanced social engineering attempts, and further phishing also really enables the attacker to more accurately impersonate trusted individuals. The second, a bit more concerning, data breach. So locations, email servers being compromised, and the access to all user accounts granted to an attacker. Now we're at the next level where a vast historical database of information, sometimes dating back 10, 20 years, is available to the attackers on a much broader scale and exposing a larger volume of confidential data. And then finally, ransomware. Imagine that the email servers not only compromised, but are now encrypted. And so we have the exposure of the data potentially, but also extended downtime and disruption of operations while we're waiting to try to restore that. So how likely are these scenarios? Unfortunately, they're becoming actually more likely. Business email compromise attacks have increased by 81% in 2022 and by 175% over the past 2 years. If you're looking kind of here at the top initial attack vectors and kind of adding up everything that's phishing related, that's 41% are caused by phishing. So, not only do we have impersonation of organizations such as Microsoft, Google, Yahoo, and Facebook, they're very, very convincing, but we have a situation where the majority of staff, not necessarily at UC, but actually in general, do not report the threat. 98% is a significant number. So how do we reduce the risk? In short, ideally is to store less in email. Originally published in 1976 and continuously updated since, current policies that email should be theoretically deleted or destroyed 1 year after its administrative use ceases. While there is policy in place, in practice, we know it's really hard to do. But if the cyber risks and policy aren't compelling enough, let's take a look at legal and compliance risks. I'm going to hand it over to Sajad.
Yeah, I mean, from a legal concern, it's more of just the amount of data that gets aggregated into one bucket, right? So email is a very high or easy target. And so we see a lot of phishing attempts, as April noted. I just put on this slide that there are a lot of different legal requirements for us to retain electronic data, right? So HIPAA gives us 6 years, and that includes emails that may have PHI. Now, in a place like UCOP, it's very easy to say don't include PHI in emails, but at some of the locations, including the health centers, which have the infrastructure to have PHI communicated through electronic means, that's something that is required and will be addressed in that location's policy. We have Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act that normally applies to financial institutions, but because UCs provide loans and have financial elements to them or aspects of their operations, we have to abide by those cybersecurity rules as well as the data retention rules. And then there are also tax requirements for look back and having documentation to prove certain elements that we're putting within our taxation documents. Now, those are legal statutory requirements for retention, but there are disclosure obligations that all of the UCs are obliged by. One are just UC's position as a public entity, the Public Records Act. And another is that we see often are the litigation holds. When we are in litigation, we will immediately start putting together holds on key document repositories. And the larger the document repository, the more documents there are for lawyers, outside lawyers and in-house lawyers to sift through, which ends up costing a significant amount of money. Similarly, for Public Records Act, we have to then go through a copious number of documents to see what is responsive and what to remove pursuant to the exemptions for the Records Act. Again, those are disclosure obligations which have no time limit. So if we host data that's 20 years old, we're required to go back and look through all of that data. So we can have the next slide. And so these are just, it's not a very well put together slide, but these are headlines of phishing attempts. So email attacks where the breaches that were disclosed had to be public notification of a breach were the emails or email systems. Now, if you don't have a thorough system of retention, data retention, you will have copious amounts of information stored in email, as April mentioned. And that means that the settlement amounts, that means the litigation amounts, the lawyer's fees for reviewing the documents that were released becomes more and more expensive. So from a dollar's perspective, it becomes a greater liability the longer that we store data. And right, like, so I also included, there was a recent litigation for San Diego Health regarding a phishing attempt. So this impacts us directly. And in some of these instances that you see, or some of these instances with phishing, the costs of settling these matters, or the costs of litigating these matters, rise exponentially because the data is just so old. Then the amount of data that's involved becomes so much more cumbersome. And those are the concerns that we have from a litigation perspective. So back to April.
Thank you, Sajad. So now just wanted to pivot a little bit to share the UCOP experience. In 2011, driven by legal, we actually did commence a project to address email retention head on. The original estimated time to complete the effort was 3 months. The actual time to complete was 18 months. So what does that tell us? Resistance. So there was a lot of additional time required to overcome the resistance to this change in some parts of the organization. To overcome it involved a lot of meetings, education, educating teams on not only the appropriate use of email and attachments, but how to use the archive and why are we making this change. The exception process had to be developed, but fortunately, as of now, as I understand it, there's only one exception in effect for a UCOP, and that's 12 years later. So this policy at UCOP is essentially after 1 year, emails are automatically deleted. There is a bit of a 4-week grace period, but after the 4 weeks, there is no possibility of recovering the email. So you can imagine, the gravity of that for those who have been accustomed to storing email indefinitely. And so there was a lot involved in the project. I won't go into all of the details. It was before my time here at UCOP, but there was, an importance of building the case for change, kind of defining what this policy would look like, how would it be deployed, making sure stakeholders kind of understood and supported the change, and some supporting processes and procedures. Getting some good documentation that was really clear, from web pages to policies, and communicating and really listening. That was foundational to success. So, and a few examples of things created were, we have a page last updated 2016, but it actually does walk through kind of the policy here at OP. And I even did a screenshot there in the upper right corner of the policy as implemented in my mailbox. So it's something that when I first joined, having not been accustomed to it, I was myself just trying to adjust. And now I really do appreciate having the automated reduction of risk, but still the ability to save emails that are important in kind of an archive format. So ultimately, I think we all recognize that this is not easy to do and that each location has stakeholder and technical complexities that exceed those at UCOP. So whether or not your location or department chooses to pursue it, we do appreciate the opportunity to share kind of our perspectives, some of the risks, and our story here today, and hope that you found this information helpful. Thanks for having us here today.
Great, thank you both. Our next speaker is Kent Wada. Kent is the Chief Privacy Officer and Director of Policy and Privacy at UCLA. He's going to talk to us today about requests for deceased UC email.
Good morning. So the title was meant to be a little bit catchy, which I think it is, but I wanted to raise this because it's something that does occur across the entire university and brings up a number of issues that I think might additionally convince you about the risks of keeping email. I know my colleagues have all encountered this, and so they may have some perspectives as well. This is not intended to be comprehensive, but again, just to raise some questions in your mind about how you use your email, particularly in terms of personal use of your university accounts. So I wanted to start just with how commercial services, social media companies and email service providers handle what happens when one of their customers, one of their account holders passes away. And if you look across, what Google says, what Facebook does, what LinkedIn does, they often they all offer some way to memorialize a social media account, so nothing more changes. In some cases, they will let you close the account if you have the right standing. It's very rare that they will actually allow you to get access to a deceased person's contents without, say, a court order, and even then they may not agree with it. Google is the most interesting in that they have this thing called the inactive account manager, which allows you to specify what you want to happen when your account goes inactive for a while. You can actually tell Google what who you want notified, what they should have access to, things like that. So I use that as a baseline in some sense because it's very privacy protective of individuals. Of course, we are not a commercial service provider. We're a university that has obligations to the university. So it's a little bit different, but nevertheless, I think it's instructive. As I said before, locations, handle this kind of thing routinely because we have a very large community, but our practices do vary. So you should certainly, if you're interested, speak to people locally on your campus. And for UCLA, we are typically, and I think this is true of every place, looking at each request on a case-by-case basis because the specifics can be important. We do distinguish between when a third party, like the executor of an estate, is asking for someone's email as opposed to for internal purposes, like the email has information about continuing a grant that's needed to continue the grant. The most difficult thing generally is when we're talking about someone from the outside, a parent, for example, asking to see their son or daughter's email because they want to know what was in their minds at the time of death. And it's very difficult, obviously, because there are competing needs and they're all legitimate that have to be considered. So some of the very specific things that we're looking at, again, legal standing, are you the executor of the deceased estate, but also, what did the deceased do? If they were an employee that routinely handled confidential information or attorney-client privileged information, then of course we simply can't give the contents of someone's email away. That's just not possible. In some cases, you might consider being able to have someone look through the email to identify things that are personal, that would be responsive to what is being requested, so that we don't give out stuff that we shouldn't be. But that has a burden associated with it and can be pretty substantial. So then it comes down to, what is the person actually asking for? Do they actually want the contents of the entire email account, which is probably the most difficult. Often, though, it's been the case that they really want access to the email address and the password really as a one-time thing, because they've unfortunately used their UC email address to create a personal account, say to do online banking. And if their spouse no longer has access to that email address and the account temporarily, they can't get onto their bank account. And so they just need that to be able to handle their business affairs. So really what's being asked for does make a big difference. Finally, just thinking from a privacy viewpoint, there was a point that I didn't mention specifically, but generally, I think as a legal matter, the privacy really have no privacy, or the deceased really have no privacy rights. But it's not just the privacy of the person whose account we're talking about, but it's all the people that they've corresponded with as well that you need to think of, and the impact on those people. Even within the context of requests for a university purpose, you shouldn't just hand over the contents of an email account because it may contain, for example, a letter of recommendation, and there was an assurance that was given to the person who wrote the recommendation that it would be maintained in confidence. So just again, need to think through what might be in that person's account. Okay, whoops. Sorry, I think oh, actually, no. Here we go. I got it right. The little asterisks, by the way, on the previous slide were meant to just emphasize that your account is a university account. It's meant primarily for your business that you see, whether that's being an instructor or a researcher or a student or administrator. And even though we have in policy, in the electronic communications policy, a very high bar, generally speaking, about individual privacy of our electronic communications, including email, it's not an absolute right. Privacy is, generally never an absolute right. Most of these things aren't. They're always in balance with many of our other obligations. And so, just as I said, someone might have to go through your email in order to decide what's personal and what's business related. And that alone means they have to be able to look at the contents of your email. So again, from the point of view, the perspective of this particular talk, certainly minimize the use of your UC account for personal uses. Heaven knows it's easy these days to get free accounts, although those have their own considerations to think about. Certainly do not use your UC email addresses to create personal accounts for your online banking, for example. And the last thing I'll just leave you with is there's a great summary that NOLA puts out about, can my digital assets pass through my will? And it gives you some really great pointers to think through about how you can be proactive in making sure that the right people have access to things you want them to have access to after you've passed away, and what you don't want them to have access to. Anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you, Kent. Our next speaker is Paula Johnson. Paula is the Director of Policy and Records Administration at UC San Diego. And today she's going to be speaking about strategic onboarding and offboarding.
Good morning, everyone. So we've sort of shared some of the issues that we all face, and we're sort of going to turn our attention slightly into what we're hoping to convey to departments across the system and to individuals. I will start with here. I will start with something to just help us not feel quite so overwhelmed by email. Though I was sitting there doing my usual calculating, listening to our colleagues, and thought, so we're really talking about 26,000 emails a year hitting our accounts in some fashion. Well, the good news for us is that 70 to 80% of that email is transitory or spam. So there are ways that we can take a look at how we handle and manage those things. And I am challenged by trying to get, next slide. There we go. So best practices, we start with onboarding. Every employee that comes on board is going to receive a new account. And we think it's very important to help them understand the university's requirements and the policies and the things that they'll need to know in order to deal with that plethora of email that hits their accounts. So we recommend in onboarding that departments come up with onboarding training specific to email and email obligations. Some best practices then from there, we go into managing time and content and rules-based management. and sort of filing tips. How can you make 26,000 emails a year palatable? And then offboarding accounts. One consideration that we have, and I checked in with UC San Diego, is that we run around 5 billion emails in email accounts presently. 5 billion. I am estimating for the University of California, on the basis of those numbers, that the University of California is dealing with something approaching 75 billion. And that includes the wonderful folks at UCOP and our colleagues who have imposed a 1-year retention on email accounts. So, offboarding accounts, what happens? What responsibility? And it's, for me, and I think for many of us, it's all about retention and building a practice. There's so little in content in our email accounts that we really need to maintain. We just do not need to maintain a great deal of what ends up coming into our accounts. So I will say, for the policy disclaimer, all university employees are individually responsible for handling and maintaining records. Our electronic communications policy squarely puts that responsibility on each of us. And email is subject to the records and information management policies. So for onboarding purposes, I think it's very important that people share and understand the records management and privacy policy. It's UC-wide, as well as the retention and destruction policy that is promulgated for everyone. It helps align what our role is as custodians of records. And I put a little more into this than I can really touch on in the amount of time we have. However, one of the things we always talk about from records and information management is setting up a file structure that makes retention easy to manage over time, whether it be in subfoldering, whether it be offline for business records, to help a new employee, and refresh for all of us, define the business content and transitory content. If 70% of the information in your email account is transitory, become very familiar with the records retention schedule. We thought it was so important system-wide that the Records and Information Management Committee made transitory records the first functional retention schedule in the list. So you don't have to search for it. It's the very first one if you go to the retention schedule at UCOP. We also recommend, particularly at San Diego, that you build a file plan to maintain business content that requires longer term retention. We want legally defensible records retention. And by building a file plan and documenting what types of records, what kinds of information up front, you're also giving, in that onboarding process, new employees a very good understanding of the operations of your departments and units. We also recommend clearing out the inbox on a daily basis, if not weekly. That is a practice. It means setting up an environment so that things that are in the inbox are not there, and incoming operational things are all you deal with on a daily basis. And that helps people a great deal, because we did this little study, and it's probably not research quality, but we found that if you leave your email in your inbox, the likelihood is you'll look at it at least 4 times. So you're spending 4 times the effort for that email sitting in your account. We recommend putting together a training program. And just so you know, the University of California has a great amount of resources available to us. The UC Learning Center has books, video, audio classes, recordings that would help all of us learn how to structure and deal with email and do other kinds of work. So in that body of 290 options, there is guidance for all of these rules. When we get into taking these courses and taking a look at these things, I also recommend that people who've been here a long time, such as myself, 21 years in the making, go out and review every once in a while and make that part of my annual training plan. So I always put into staff training some kinds of refresher just to make sure everyone is up to date. If you look at our colleague Kent Wada's presentation, that would help you understand that we have definitely evolving privacy issues on campuses, and we want to address those. So in a way, by doing some review, it'll just help us keep up to date on these things, particularly if we make the university a career. And lastly, I want to touch on offboarding. So in offboarding, if we start with the holder of the account as the responsible party, we really need you to consider that when you're leaving, there is probably not going to be enough time to deal with 100,000 emails sitting in your account. Just, you know, you're creating an interesting dynamic there. So we recommend that you do these things on an ongoing basis, but if you are leaving the university and the account is going to be decommissioned, that you delete your personal subfolders and any content that is personal from it. That would be the first thing I would recommend anybody do, though my first vote is best practice. Do not use your university email account for personal business, such as Kent described. So also understand that if you've gone out and created a number of rules, like one of the little tips was create a rule that all of the sources for the university's newsletters and content that come to you, you go ahead and have that stored in a subfolder that you can look at them all at once and not stop your workday to, you know, review everything. If you do that kind of thing, we recommend that you keep those rules when you leave, so that if there is anything incoming while the account is inactive, and there is a time frame between inactivating accounts and the person's leaving, that things are still being handled, because the manager or supervisor of the employee becomes the responsible party for the content. So if there was ever a little bit of a push for everyone to consider what they need to do with this, recognize that upon leaving the university's employment, the supervisor becomes the custodian of record under the policy. So obviously, we think if you start with a programmatic approach, develop a retention environment for your office, develop your records program internally within the office to identify the common types of things that need to be retained longer than an email or transitory or general correspondence record. And if you do those things overall, you'll come to the end of your employment 21 years later or something like that, and not be leaving hundreds of thousands of things behind that frankly would be accessible under the Public Records Act. It's all about building a practice. And as I've made some mention of this, these are tips that are highlighted and offered for all of us. And I also want to throw in there that you can reach out to persons in your IT departments, your records managers on campuses. You can reach out to the committee and the system-wide group. there are resources in addition to engaging with the campus archivists and understanding the small collection of information out of all that transitory correspondence, which might have enduring value. On a practical basis, our campus shifts records to the archivists that are transitory as a matter of disposal, and allow them to go through and do their work to classify and identify any records that they believe would have enduring value. And so we don't take on the onus of that ourselves. We take it on in consultation with the archivist. And I've listed some resources for you here. And if you need anything from us, please reach out. We're definitely here to help you.
Great, thank you, Paula. Our next speaker is Kelly Walker. Kelly is the information consultant at UCSD, and Kelly will be talking about email best practices today.
Thank you, Astrid. Let me switch screens and we can begin. So I'm going to quickly cover some best practices and tips. I like to call them the DSWs of good email management strategies. I use DSWs because I have a specific love for shoes, but that's a different story. I hope you all can see my screen, and I shall begin. So, first of all, let's talk about the Ds of managing email. What you want to do is kind of decide which D matters when you open your email box for the day. Do you do it now? If an email requires little to no action or can be completed quickly, take an action immediately. Oftentimes you'll receive an email that may require additional time to respond. Don't leave that sender hanging. Delegate, defer, or maybe let the sender know you'll be back in touch with them. Speaking of delegation, if it's someone else's responsibility to handle and you've gotten that email, delegate it to that person or that team. Get it out of your email box if no action is required by you. Maybe you need to defer an item. Defer items that may require more time to review or act on later. Consider filing it in the subject matter folder for follow-up outside of your immediate email box. D for designate items for action later. Create subject matter folders for important items or projects or information you'll need for later, preferably again outside of your email box. Maybe consider a knowledge management tool or electronic file sharing system for yourself or as a collaboration tool for you and others. And most importantly, delete, as you've heard from our other colleagues, ridding your box and your time of unimportant emails are really important. Delete it if you don't need it, don't wait. Studies tend to indicate that 70% of your email traffic is transitory and has no need for retention after you've already read it. So delete, delete, delete. What about the S's? The S's of managing your email box. Give it some structure. Stop. Break the habit and stop reading emails as soon as they arrive. Sometimes it's appropriate to disable your notifications. Schedule. Schedule blocks of time to review and clear your email box. Don't make a habit of checking email every few minutes or when an alert arrives. It can easily decrease your productivity. Consider setting up some rules. Set up rules for automatic sorting and routing of your email. For example, you can set up rules to automatically route news items or social media or group feeds, etc., to specific folders that you can look at and take a look at later or review later, excuse me. Sort. As a general default, sort your email. Use things such as your sender or by date or by subject matter. It makes organization a lot simpler for you at times. And then send it off. Send it to a subject matter folder or a file. Use it for storing information temporarily if it's in your email box. But again, reconsider those electronic storage options like an electronic file sharing system. And the W's. At the end of the day, ask yourself a few questions. Who sent it to you? Is it important to you and the work you're doing? Or is it just a simple FYI? What is it? Or what do you need to do with this email? If nothing, consider going back to those Ds because perhaps it's time to delete, delete, delete. When did you get it? When is action required? Is it something that you can defer or delegate or perhaps send to those pre-designated folders I talked about? And why did you receive it? Or more importantly, why do you still need it? Consider deleting. That's my tip of the day. And where should it go after you've read it? Take a look back at those D's and S's and be sure to consider it done. Mark it as read. Also, I wanted to give you a few tips and things to remember about your records and your UC information that you use and store. If an email or other record pertains to UC business, practicing your DSW should help you quickly make decisions regarding retaining the records you do need to keep in compliance with the UC records retention schedule. Please also make sure you note, and I think a lot of us already spoke about it, university records are subject to disclosure under the Public Records Act and the California Information Practices Act, which includes email and other administrative business records in any format you may have. So that includes emails and Word documents, spreadsheets, voicemails, etc. So anything that's conducted with respect to university business can be considered a record and subject to disclosure. So I always try to remind people, if you don't want personal or nasty thoughts memorialized on the front page of your local newspaper, practice good email etiquette and keep that personal business separate. And please be kind. Also, lastly, please do not delete any email or paper or electronic records that are subject to disclosure under the CPRA, or CPRA being the Public Records Act or the Information Practices Act. Also, please don't delete records that are related to pending or potential litigation or any records subject to an audit or administrative mandate. If those issues do come up, please contact us as your records managers or your counsel for additional information about those issues. Last but not least, do you have records of enduring historical value to the university? Then you'll definitely be interested in hearing what's up next. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Kelly. And so up next, we do have Matt Stahl. Matt is the University Archivist at University of California, Santa Barbara, and he will be talking to you today about system-wide archives.
Okay, thank you for the nice lead in, Kelly. That was good. Let me see. Okay, so I am going to kind of be taking a top-down approach here to looking at kind of what we see as a UC-wide problem. And when I say we, I am speaking on behalf of the UC Archivist Council. This has been mentioned a few times by Paula and Kelly both. Every university, every UC has a designated person to manage the preservation of the university's historically valuable records. Though UC Riverside has a vacancy currently because Andrea Hoff moved to Los Angeles, who she used to be the archivist at Riverside. So I'm not sure what Riverside plan is yet, but they will be filling that position. And just a general note that all these people are available to answer questions about archiving anything on your campus, whether digital, analog, email, etc. So together, we formed the UC Archivist Council, and we set the policies regarding archiving of permanently valuable records, deciding what materials should be saved. Just a little bit of background on this. University Archives program actually dates back to 1963, when UC President Clark Kerr established a system-wide records management program to manage the increasing volume of university records. And if you think it was increasing in 1963, it's dramatically increasing now. We've added more campuses since then, and yeah, it's just kind of growing exponentially. So to support the preservation of permanently valuable historical records, university librarians were instructed in 1964 to establish an archives program at each campus. And then in 1969, UC further affirmed its ownership of all administrative records created by UC employees in the performance of their duties. Just a couple of things to call your attention to in this description here. Put them in possession of files, record, or documents pertaining to such duties. Such filed record or documents, including but not limited to correspondence, reports, writings, and other papers, records, maps, tapes, photographic film, prints, magnetic, and punch cards. That's a nice memory there. I don't actually have any memory of it, but I've seen them. But the key thing that we're really relates to what we're talking about today is correspondence. And just want to point out, punch cards were used for, data storage and data retention. And obviously, we've kind of moved beyond that format. But just as, collection policies have updated for other areas, we need to consider updating policies of archiving correspondence, because historically, analog collections have included correspondence. And correspondence is a vital element of a university's archival records. It provides a window into the decision-making processes behind major policy changes and documents developments in curriculum and departmental growth. Archiving official correspondence provides a measure of transparency and public accountability as well. However, the advent of email has actually removed correspondence from most modern archival collections. So when we get a modern collection from a department, there's usually not correspondence in it anymore. There was, of course, the early 2000 periods where people were printing and filing emails, which we do not actually recommend. But, there is a gap in the historical record, because, full disclosure, I can't actually promise this entire box is full of correspondence, but it makes a nice image. But, correspondence and archives went from looking like that to looking like this. This is a snapshot of my inbox from yesterday. And you can actually, we've mentioned the number of transitory emails that we receive from an archival perspective. Just looking through this, pretty much everything that you see on this page, none of these emails would be considered historically permanently valuable. But there is a problem in that essentially no UC campus is currently archiving email in the university archives. And when I say this, I'm referring specifically to administrative emails, not to emails that come in with manuscript collections. Like sometimes a donor will give us their papers, or a faculty member will give us their papers, and they'll include their personal email or their work email with that. But that's kind of a separate issue. So what we're looking at is, administrative correspondence. One of the main reasons for this, I would argue, is that is just what people have been talking about, and that's just the sheer volume of email that exists. So unlike traditional correspondence, which might have come from a designated person in an office or something, email comes and goes from every employee. And as Paula said earlier, current estimates place the total number of existing emails on UC servers at around, I have 85 billion in my presentation, but Paula said 75. Well, either way, they're gargantuan numbers, 75 to 85 billion. And that amount is growing daily. Now, obviously, saving all that email is just not possible. And we don't actually want to archive all that email. But this has been mentioned a few times today also. I just want to point out every email account can contain within it non-records, non-permanent records, as well as permanently valuable records. My previous job, I worked for the Senate Commerce Committee, and we did archive every email account of every employee, and made an effort to weed out as many non-permanently valuable records as possible, or emails as possible. And based on my experience there, it matches up with the numbers Paula was giving earlier, where approximately 75 to 80% of email is not permanently valuable. That is anecdotal from my part, but it matches up with other statistical studies. So I'd like to pepper my presentations with pop culture references and things like that. So just a couple of examples here of things you might find in an email inbox or sent folder or something. Obviously an email like this angry sandwich email would be a non-record and completely transitory and can be deleted. The next one about rescheduling a web seminar can be considered a record, but it is definitely transitory. And transitory means, of course, it can be deleted once its administrative use has ceased. So in this case, probably once you read it, you could get rid of it. And then there are arguably within every email inbox records that should be considered permanently valuable. So emails related to policy decisions, curriculum development, COVID shutdown decisions and procedures, to cite recent examples. The one question that's commonly asked of archivists is, so for example, if we have a memo that is publicly released, why do we need all the back and forth discussion that led up to that memo? And I like to draw kind of a historical parallel here. You can ask a similar question, why do we need or have to study the Federalist Papers if we have the Constitution? For historians, kind of that discussion that goes into crafting documents is, often more important than the final document itself. And not that an associate vice chancellor's memo about repaving a parking lot is equal in stature to the Constitution, but for historical research and as evidence of our role as keeper to the public trust, the discussion that led to a policy decision is often just as important as the decision itself. Now, obviously, we cannot, as I said, we cannot keep email from all employees. I have some numbers here. There are obviously far too many employees to even consider archiving everybody's email. UCSB, one of the smaller campuses, has over 10,000 employees. UC San Diego had over 40,000. And I believe if you add in the medical school, that puts it over 50,000. The entire UC system has more than 227,000 employees. Obviously, it's neither possible nor desirable to archive the email of every employee. Now, faced with a similar problem, but on a much larger scale, the National Archives developed a program known as the Capstone Approach. And essentially what the National Archives does when it comes to email, it allows each agency to identify which of its employees' email should be identified for archiving based on their role within the agency. All other employees' accounts are considered non-permanent. And for example, while some of these department employees with temporary accounts here might have permanently valuable emails in their account, the nature of email itself is such that that same permanently valuable email probably exists in one of the designated employee accounts in the green and blue sections. Now this other universities, state governments, and corporations have implemented some form of capstone tailored to their own needs with varying levels of success. Both the State Archives of Illinois and the University of Illinois system, for example, have implemented this practice. The UC Archivist Council, again, I'm speaking on behalf of all of them, thinks a similar approach, not necessarily identical, but similar, could be used in the UC system, with each campus having the flexibility to identify which individuals in their campus hierarchy should have their email archived. Again, we can't archive all 85 million emails of all 227,000 employees, but without some sort of process in place, university archives are losing decades of historical records. And I think one nice thing to add about this is that for this kind of system implemented at different campuses would mean that for the majority of employees, they don't need to worry about their email archiving, at least in terms of sending it to the university archives when they leave. Just a quick note about, I meant to say this earlier, but just kind of a warning. When you use, like if you're using Outlook or something like that, and you use the archive feature, that actually pulls your emails off of the server and saves them in what's called a local PST file. And that is saved on your local hard drive or something. So it actually makes your email less secure in terms of preservation and backup. So if you do that, if you do something like use the archive feature, you want to make sure you're saving that file on kind of a redundant backup or something like that. That's just a little aside from there. But so again, the UC Archives Council, you know, one of the things we struggle with is there's no system-wide policy on when, where, and how to archive email. So, you know, we kind of think this kind of approach would work possibly for the system. And that's it.
Hey, thank you, Matt.
Mhm.
Our panelists have been answering questions throughout the presentation, so hopefully a lot of those questions were answered, but we still have some. So Jackie and Neil, do you want to start fielding this?
Sure, and I realize we are at 11 o'clock, so if anyone needs to drop off, I totally understand. We will try to, if anyone had put questions in the chat that have names on them, we will still, I suppose, try to connect you with the person the question was to, but some were anonymous. Of course, if you don't get your question answered, please feel free to send it to us at records@ucop.edu, and we will try to send it to the person who was relevant to. So let's see, ones we didn't get to answer. Of course, a lot of people have been asking specific questions about how saving things work on your campus. The technical answer is going to be different for each campus. Of course, the way your email is set up. For example, for Outlook, I know a lot of you are Gmail, so I recommend you reach out to your local IT representatives or your local records management committee person about that. And then let's see. A number of people have asked if there's a sort of a retention policy in place sort of globally for Teams and Slack and stuff, if those are set to automatically delete across the UCs or on each campus. And I think the answer probably is that there is not a system-wide policy related to those automatically deleting.
Yeah, I can speak really quickly. Yeah, there is no system-wide policy. I mean, from an IT security perspective, I think it would fall under the retention regarding that 1 year communications. It depends also on how you're using Slack, right? If you're using it to or Zoom chat to communicate about one of those you know, groups of data regarding financial transactions or things of that nature, there would be different policies. I know at UCOP, or I believe at UCOP, there is for Zoom and Teams, there's a 1 year data retention. I think I had this very discussion, because they mimicked the email retention policy. to these other collaboration tools. So that's how OP is doing it. And I don't know how the other locations are doing it, but that's a valid point. Slack is a different beast because some users are not using Slack pursuant to a contract. They're using the free version, and there's a lot of concerns about that, especially with respect to data retention. The inability to do proper data retention or litigation holds using the free version of Slack. So I would caution against using those versions.
With
And
respect to, I was gonna say, just excuse me, that with respect to deleting those things on our campus, you must be your own steward for deleting those records. And so it's always good practice to kind of look back, you know, weekly or monthly to see where you're at and delete those, especially sensitive items that you might share with Teams or other messaging systems.
I selected to answer a question live about, does a UC staff person have the right to refuse access to their UC email when they retire? The answer is no. Any lawyer on here can correct me if I'm wrong, but I see Sajad nodding. Yeah, it's important to remember, you do not own your UC email. UC owns your email, and that's another reason, why Kent would recommend, I believe, I don't want to speak for Kent, but recommend not using your email for, banking and things like that, because it's not your email. It's the university's email.
So maybe I'll just add, again, as in so many things, that the devil is in the details. There are specific circumstances that might change. I mean, certainly what Matt just said is absolutely true. You're issued a UC email account for university purposes, and it wouldn't make sense that the university doesn't have access to its own stuff. But if, for example, you're a faculty member, in this case, a staff member was specified, some of the content may be the intellectual property of the faculty member, as opposed to the university, and same with the student. So just there are new nuances there to think about.
let's see. And then someone else said, how do you quickly delete emails? I have millions of emails from the last 15 years. I would also like to know that because I totally don't have tons of emails in my personal inbox.
I might be able to help with this a little bit because I have to go through orphan email accounts, which is never very fun. One thing that you can do is sort your email into yearly buckets. And if you put a rule on the subfolder for the year, it will, and then run it on all the emails that are in that bucket, it will auto delete everything in that bucket that has extended beyond the retention period. If you have them nicely organized in subfolders, I would recommend moving them out of subfolders and putting them in a single subfolder that you could run that rule on. If you no longer need a content related to a topic and it doesn't have enduring historical value, consider doing that operation. I will say that as a practice, I try to advise everyone to spend 4 hours twice a year going through whatever subfolders you've created and seeing what you could do to knock down the things that you've been storing, because obviously we don't know when we receive an email how long we may need it. And so to that end, I recommend that you take a look at your subfolders a couple times a year and make decisions about it. But go ahead and set up a rule and put the emails with their date in the rule, into the bucket with the rule, and then run the rule on all the content in the folder. And that should help you do a lot of cleanup quite easily.
Okie dokie. Let's see. Someone else email said, is the sender the office of record? If I receive it, can I delete it?
Did I hear, is the sender the office of record once I send it? Can
Once I
delete
receive it, can I delete it?
That's a good question. So we're talking about whether or not a record is the official record or it's a copy. And typically, if you're not the doer, so say you have something that you actually have to accomplish with this email, you need it and you can use it as a reference tool. You can keep it or move it to that project or subfolder. With respect to once you've seen it, and if you don't need it and you don't need to provide action, then we recommend deleting it. If you don't need it and you've taken in the information, you've stored it in your mind, your brain, you're good to go.
But
There's an
don't-
action again, if there's an
Yeah.
action item, go ahead, Paula.
Well, I was going to say, one thing to consider about email when this question comes up, in addition to definitely get in the habit, muscle memory habit of deleting if it's necessary, but the actual sender and receiver both have an original email in their accounts. Why am I saying that? Because there's metadata attached to the email having been sent, and there's metadata attached to the email having been received. So in effect, if you think that the email should be preserved or maintained, take action on it. If it's transitory, take action on that. And if you think that you don't need it for the future, recognize that your colleague who sent it to you is doing the same action.
Okay, well, we are now about 10 minutes after, so I think probably we need to call it. Thank you guys so much for staying after and continuing to answer questions. This has been really great. I think we got a lot of super amazing information out there. It will be available on the UCOP website. I did link that at chat at one point, but it will be under their record system-wide records management committee tips and tricks, is where all of the recordings for the electronic record days, this one and previous, are available. If you have any continuing questions and to answer, please feel free to email records@ucop.edu and we will get that to you. And thank you to all our speakers today. You all did a great job, and I hope everyone got a lot out of it.
Happy Electronic Records Day. Delete,
Happy
delete,
Electronic
delete.
Records Day.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you, everyone.